The autumn wind carried a desperate cry across the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, Colorado, in 1875, where Rebecca Ellis clutched her infant son to her chest one final time. The 24-year-old widow's tears fell onto her baby's forehead as she stood outside the general store, her shaking hands adjusting the worn blanket around his tiny frame. 8 months had passed since influenza had claimed her husband, leaving her alone with a newborn and a mountain of debt that grew with each passing day. "Please," Rebecca whispered to no one in particular, her voice breaking as the early morning light cast long shadows down the dirt road. "Someone who can give him a proper life." Rebecca had not eaten in 2 days, saving the last of her milk for little Thomas. Their small cabin on the edge of town was cold now that she could no longer afford firewood. The landlord had given her until the end of the week before eviction. The baby deserved better than a slow death from hunger or cold alongside his failing mother. A crowd began to gather as the townspeople moved about their morning routines, their whispers carrying in the still air. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, shook her head in disapproval. Mr. Harrison, who owned the saloon, turned away in embarrassment. No one stepped forward. "Is there no Christian soul who can take my boy?" Rebecca called out, her voice stronger now, fueled by desperation. "I have nothing left to give him." "I reckon that's not entirely true, madam." The deep voice came from behind her. Rebecca turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. As he stepped closer, she could make out his features' weathered skin bronzed by years under the open sky, dark hair peppered with silver at the temples, and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, worn boots, sturdy denim, a dust-covered hat held respectfully in his hands. "Preston Harrington," he introduced himself with a slight nod. "I own the Double H Ranch about 5 miles east of town." Rebecca had heard of the Double H. It was one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the territory, though she had never seen its owner up close. He was older than she'd expected, perhaps mid-30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. "Rebecca Ellis," she replied, unconsciously clutching Thomas tighter. "And this is my son." Preston stepped closer, towering over her slight frame. The baby hiccuped and turned toward the stranger, tiny fingers reaching toward Preston's weathered hand. "Mrs. Ellis," Preston said, his voice lowered so only she could hear, "I understand desperation. I've faced it myself, but you shouldn't be giving away your child, not like this." Rebecca felt anger flare within her empty stomach. "I don't need judgment, Mr. Harrington. I need a miracle." "Then perhaps we can help each other," Preston replied. "I need a housekeeper for my ranch. The position comes with room and board for you both. Your son stays with you where he belongs." Rebecca's knees nearly buckled. "I don't understand." Preston looked down at the baby, then back to her tear-stained face. His expression softened as he spoke words that would forever change her life. "Mrs. Ellis, no child belongs in a stranger's arms when his mother still lives, and no mother should have to make such a choice." He reached out, gently steadying her elbow. "You'll both belong in my arms, my protection, I mean, at the Double H." The crowd around them had grown silent, all eyes on the exchange between the desperate widow and the ranch owner. Rebecca searched his face for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but found only earnest concern. "Why would you help us?" she asked, suspicion mingling with hope. "Because 18 years ago my sister stood where you stand now," Preston answered quietly. "She didn't find help in time. I've regretted it every day since." The baby began to fuss, his cries growing stronger. "He's hungry," Rebecca whispered, shame coloring her cheeks. "I haven't been able to." "My wagon's just down the street," Preston said, already removing his coat to drape around her shoulders. "Mrs. Whitaker, my cook, will have breakfast waiting. We can discuss the details after you've both been fed." Rebecca hesitated only a moment before nodding. What choice did she have? Death from starvation or a chance at survival, even if temporary, for her child. "I accept your offer, Mr. Harrington." "Preston," he corrected gently. "And you won't regret this, Mrs. Ellis, I promise you that." As Preston guided her toward his wagon, Rebecca felt the weight of the town's stairs. Some faces showed relief, others curiosity, and a few displayed obvious disapproval at her accepting help from a single man. But for the first time in months, Rebecca felt something other than despair unfurling in her chest. It wasn't hope, not quite yet, but it was a step away from the abyss. The wagon ride to the Double H Ranch was mostly silent. Rebecca sat rigid on the wooden seat, her baby now sleeping peacefully against her chest, wrapped in Preston's coat. The late October landscape passed by in a blur of amber and gold as autumn painted the Colorado foothills. Occasionally, Preston would point out landmarks or share brief facts about the territory, but he seemed to understand her need for quiet contemplation. "The main house is just beyond those trees," Preston finally said as they crested a small hill. "It's not fancy, but it's solid and warm." As the ranch came into view, Rebecca's eyes widened. The not-fancy house was a large two-story structure with a wide front porch and smoke curling invitingly from the chimney. Several outbuildings dotted the property, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing in fenced pastures. A bunkhouse stood off to one side where ranch hands would sleep. The operation was far more substantial than she had imagined. "You live here alone?" she asked, finding her voice. "Just me, Mrs. Whitaker, who cooks and keeps the house, and about 8 ranch hands who stay in the bunkhouse," Preston replied. "My foreman, Hank Miller, has a small cabin near the east pasture." As the wagon pulled up to the house, the front door swung open to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman in her 60s, wiping her hands on a well-used apron. "You're late for breakfast, Mr. Harrington," the woman called out before noticing Rebecca and the baby. Her expression shifted from annoyance to surprise, then curiosity. Preston helped Rebecca down from the wagon. "Mrs. Whitaker, this is Mrs. Rebecca Ellis and her son. They'll be staying with us. Mrs. Ellis will be taking on housekeeping duties." Mrs. Whitaker's eyebrows shot up, but she quickly composed herself. "Well then, you're both just in time for flapjacks. Come in before they get cold." The house was warm and smelled of coffee, bacon, and baking bread. Rebecca felt dizzy with hunger as she followed Mrs. Whitaker to the kitchen, where a large wooden table was set for breakfast. Preston hung his hat on a peg by the door and gestured for her to sit. "Eat first," he said. "We can talk after." Rebecca didn't need to be told twice. Balancing Thomas in one arm, she ate with her free hand, trying not to appear too ravenous despite her desperate hunger. The food was simple but abundant flapjacks with maple syrup, bacon, scrambled eggs, and fresh biscuits. After months of increasingly meager meals, it felt like a feast fit for royalty. Mrs. Whitaker busied herself around the kitchen, occasionally glancing at Rebecca and the baby with undisguised curiosity. Preston ate quietly, his eyes often drifting to mother and child with an expression Rebecca couldn't quite read. When Thomas began to fuss again, Mrs. Whitaker approached without hesitation. "Let me hold the little one while you finish your meal, dear." Rebecca hesitated only briefly before allowing the older woman to take Thomas. Mrs. Whitaker cooed and bounced the baby with practiced ease. "What a handsome boy," she commented. "How old is he?" 4 months, Rebecca answered, watching anxiously as another person held her child. "Strong little fellow," Mrs. Whitaker observed. "Hungry, though. We've got some cow's milk we can warm for him. Not as good as mother's milk, but it'll do in a pinch." Rebecca felt her cheeks flush with shame. "I haven't been able to feed him properly. I tried, but—" "No explanations needed," Mrs. Whitaker interrupted kindly. "You're both here now, and we'll set things right." After breakfast, Mrs. Whitaker took Thomas to prepare a bottle while Preston led Rebecca to a small sitting room off the main hallway. The room was comfortably furnished with a settee, several armchairs, and bookshelves lining one wall. A fire crackled in the fireplace, keeping the autumn chill at bay. "Please sit," Preston gestured to the settee. Rebecca perched on the edge, hands folded tightly in her lap. Now that her immediate hunger had been satisfied, anxiety returned. She was at the mercy of this stranger's charity, and she had no illusions about how precarious such arrangements could be. "Mr. Harrington, Preston," he corrected again. "Preston," she amended. I'm grateful for your kindness, but I need to understand what you expect from me. He took a seat in the armchair opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Fair question. The position is straightforward. I need someone to help keep the house in order, dusting, sweeping, laundry, that sort of thing. Mrs. Whittaker handles the cooking and most of the heavier work, but she's getting on in years and could use the assistance. And in return, room and board for you and your son. A small salary, $15 a month to start. Your own bedroom with a connecting nursery for the baby. Sundays off unless there's an emergency. It was more than generous, which only increased Rebecca's suspicion. And what else? She asked bluntly. Preston's eyes widened slightly before understanding dawned in his expression. He straightened, putting more distance between them. Nothing else, Mrs. Ellis. I'm offering employment, not anything improper. You have my word as a gentleman. Rebecca had heard such promises before. Her late husband, Samuel, had been a gambler who promised the moon and delivered only heartache and debt. Still, she had little choice but to take Preston at his word for now. I accept your terms, she said quietly. But I want to be clear, if at any time I feel uncomfortable or that my son is not safe, we will leave immediately. Preston nodded solemnly. I would expect nothing less. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch grounds. There's something else you should know. Rebecca tensed. Here it comes, she thought. The ranch hands don't come to the main house except for business or emergencies. They're good men, but I value privacy. Mrs. Whittaker lives in a room off the kitchen. The upstairs is my domain and now yours and your son's. Our paths may not cross often, as I'm frequently out with the cattle or handling business matters. I understand, Rebecca replied, relief mingling with a new concern, but I should mention I've never been a housekeeper before. My husband was a store clerk in Denver before we moved to Redemption Creek. I kept our home, of course, but nothing this size. Preston turned back to face her, a slight smile softening his weather-worn features. Mrs. Whittaker will show you what needs doing. I don't expect perfection, Mrs. Ellis, just honest effort. From the doorway, Mrs. Whittaker cleared her throat. The baby's settled with his bottle in the blue room upstairs. I've laid out some fresh linens and found an old cradle from the attic. It'll need a good cleaning, but it's sturdy enough. Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker, Preston said. Would you show Mrs. Ellis to her room? I need to check on the men at the north pasture. As Preston left, Rebecca followed Mrs. Whittaker up the wide staircase to the second floor. The older woman chattered amiably as they walked. Been with Mr. Harrington since he built this place 8 years ago, came out from Boston with nothing but determination and his inheritance from his uncle. Built this ranch from scratch, he did. She paused at a door midway down the hallway. This will be your room. The connecting door leads to a small room perfect for the little one. The bedroom was larger than any Rebecca had ever occupied. A 4-poster bed with a patchwork quilt dominated the space. A dresser with a mirror, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a comfortable rocking chair near the window completed the furnishings. Through the connecting door, she could see a smaller room where Thomas lay in a wooden cradle, contentedly drinking from a glass bottle. It's very generous, Rebecca managed, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. Mrs. Whittaker patted her arm. Mr. Harrington is a good man, keeps to himself mostly, but fair and decent. Don't let his quiet ways fool you, he notices everything. Has he had many housekeepers? Rebecca asked carefully. Mrs. Whittaker's laugh was like the clucking of a mother hen. Lord, no, I've been trying to get him to hire help for years. The ranch is growing and I'm not getting any younger. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Between us, I think seeing you and your little one in town struck something in him. He doesn't talk much about his past, but I know he lost his sister and her baby many years ago. Tragic business. Rebecca moved to the cradle, gently stroking Thomas's cheek as he drank. He mentioned his sister this morning. Did he now? Mrs. Whittaker seemed surprised. That's more than he said to most in all these years. She straightened her apron. Well, I'll let you get settled. Rest today. You look dead on your feet, if you don't mind my saying. Tomorrow's soon enough to start working. After Mrs. Whittaker left, Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the morning catching up with her. Just hours ago, she had been prepared to give away her only child to save his life. Now they were both safe, warm, and fed in this unexpected sanctuary. She should feel relief, gratitude. Instead, uncertainty gnawed at her. Experience had taught her that nothing came without a price. What would Preston Harrington eventually expect in return for his generosity? And what would she do when that day came? For now, though, Thomas was safe. That would have to be enough. The first week at Double H Ranch passed in a blur of new routines and cautious adjustments. Rebecca learned the rhythm of the household under Mrs. Whittaker's patient guidance. The older woman showed her how to polish the wooden banisters to a shine, where to find the best lavender to place between linens, and how to operate the large washing machine in the utility room, a newfangled contraption that Preston had ordered from back east. Thomas thrived with regular feedings and warm surroundings. His cheeks filled out, and he began to smile more often. Rebecca felt her own strength returning as well, nourished by Mrs. Whittaker's hearty cooking and uninterrupted nights of sleep. Preston Harrington remained something of a mystery. True to his word, their paths rarely crossed. He left the house before dawn most mornings and often returned after Rebecca had retired for the night. On the few occasions they did interact, his manner was unfailingly polite but reserved. On her 8th day at the ranch, Rebecca was dusting in the study when she came across a framed photograph partially hidden behind books on a shelf. The image showed a young woman with a serious expression, holding an infant swaddled in a christening gown. Something about the woman's eyes so similar to Preston's made Rebecca certain this was his sister. Her name was Penelope. Rebecca startled at Preston's voice, nearly dropping the photograph. She hadn't heard him enter the room. "I'm sorry," she stammered, carefully returning the frame to its place. "I didn't mean to pry." Preston moved closer, taking the photograph and looking at it with an expression of old grief. "No need for apologies. You're naturally curious about the household you've joined." Rebecca hesitated, then asked gently, "What happened to her?" Preston was silent for so long that Rebecca thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. Penelope was 19 when she fell in love with a cavalry officer stationed near our family home in Virginia. When she discovered she was with child, he promised marriage but was deployed west before the ceremony could take place. My father, a proud, unyielding man, disowned her. Preston set the photograph down, his fingers lingering on the frame. She wrote to her officer, but no replies came. I helped her as best I could, but I was just 22 myself and trying to establish my own path. When she went into labor, I was away on business. The baby girl survived the birth. My sister did not. "I'm so sorry," Rebecca said softly. "The baby Elizabeth lived only 3 months without a mother's milk or proper care." He didn't finish the sentence. "That's why you stopped me that day in town," Rebecca realized. Preston nodded once, his jaw tight. "I couldn't save them, but I could help you and your son." The simple honesty in his statement touched something in Rebecca. For the first time, she truly believed his offer of help came without hidden motives. "What brought you to Colorado?" she asked, changing the subject to easier ground. A slight smile eased the tension around his mouth. "My mother's brother had a small holding here. When he died, he left it to me about 50 acres and a dozen head of cattle. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I built the rest over time." "It's impressive," Rebecca said sincerely. "You've created something substantial here." "It's a good life," Preston agreed, "demanding but satisfying." He glanced out the window where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. "Storm's coming. I need to check the herd in the south pasture." After he left, Rebecca found herself thinking about the photograph and the story behind it. Preston Harrington was more complex than she had initially believed. His kindness toward her and Thomas wasn't simply charity, it was a form of redemption for a past he couldn't change. That evening, the promised storm arrived with violent force. Wind howled around the eaves of the house, and rain lashed against the windows. Rebecca sat in the rocking chair in her room, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the tempest outside. A sharp knock at her door startled her. Mrs. Whittaker stood in the hallway, concern etched on her face. Mr. Harrington and two of the hands haven't returned from the south pasture. Hank just rode in to say the creek's flooding and they may be stranded. Is there anything I can do? Rebecca asked, rising from the chair. Keep water boiling and blankets warming by the fire, the older woman instructed. If they make it back, they'll be soaked to the bone and half frozen. For the next 3 hours, Rebecca maintained a vigil in the kitchen, periodically checking the boiling water and rotating blankets near the fireplace to keep them warm. Thomas slept in a makeshift bed she had arranged on a padded bench away from drafts. Just past midnight, shouts from outside announced the missing men's return. Rebecca rushed to the door with Mrs. Whittaker as 3 riders dismounted in the driving rain. Preston was supporting a younger man who appeared unable to stand on his own. He's taken a bad fall, Preston shouted over the storm. His leg's broken. Abe, get the doctor from town. The third man immediately remounted and rode back into the tempest as Preston half carried the injured ranch hand toward the house. Bring him to the sitting room, Mrs. Whittaker directed. The sofa there will be easiest. Rebecca quickly removed Thomas from his makeshift bed and carried him upstairs, returning moments later to find Preston and Mrs. Whittaker struggling to remove the injured man's muddy clothing. Let me help, Rebecca said, stepping forward without hesitation. For the next hour, she worked alongside Preston to clean the young ranch hand's injuries, while Mrs. Whittaker prepared poultices and bandages. The broken leg was the worst of it, a compound fracture that had pierced through skin, but he also had numerous cuts and what appeared to be a dislocated shoulder. Preston's hands were steady as he cleaned the wound on the leg, but Rebecca noticed the tight set of his jaw and the concern in his eyes. This wasn't just an employee to him, he cared about the men who worked his land. You're doing well, Jim, Preston assured the young man, who bit back groans of pain. Doctor will be here soon. When they had done all they could, Mrs. Whittaker took over the watch while Preston finally stepped back, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. His clothes were still soaked, and he shivered slightly despite the warmth of the room. You need to change before you catch your death, Rebecca said firmly, surprising herself with her boldness. I'll bring hot coffee to your room. Too tired to argue, Preston nodded and headed upstairs. Rebecca quickly checked on Thomas, who continued to sleep peacefully, before preparing a tray with coffee and some of Mrs. Whittaker's leftover biscuits. When she knocked on Preston's door 15 minutes later, his quiet enter sounded weary. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, dressed in dry clothes but with his hair still damp, staring at his hands as if seeing something beyond the present moment. Coffee, she announced, setting the tray on a small table, and something to eat. Thank you, he said, looking up. In the lamplight, without his usual reserve, he appeared younger and somehow more vulnerable. Jim is one of our newest hands, barely 20. His mother will have my hide if anything happens to him. Rebecca poured a cup of coffee and handed it to him. You did everything possible. The doctor will handle the rest. Preston took a long drink before responding. It was my decision to check that pasture today. I knew the storm was coming, but I thought we had more time. You couldn't have known how quickly the creek would rise, Rebecca said. From what Mrs. Whittaker has told me, you're a careful and considerate employer. Your men respect you. He looked at her with surprise, as if not expecting such insight from her. You've been talking about me with Mrs. Whittaker? Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. Not inappropriately. I simply wanted to understand the household better. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. And what else has Mrs. Whittaker told you about me? That you're stubborn as a mule when it comes to your own welfare, Rebecca replied, feeling suddenly bold. That you work too hard and delegate too little, that you need a wife to soften your rough edges. The last comment escaped before she could censor herself. Preston's eyebrows rose and Rebecca wished the floor would open and swallow her whole. I apologize, she said quickly. That was presumptuous. To her surprise, Preston laughed a genuine sound that transformed his face. Mrs. Whittaker has been trying to marry me off since the day she arrived. Pay her no mind on that score. The moment lightened, and Rebecca found herself smiling in return. Eat your biscuits before they get cold. I should check on Thomas. As she turned to leave, Preston called her name. When she looked back, his expression had sobered. Thank you, Rebecca, not just for the coffee but for your help tonight. You showed remarkable composure. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Good night, Preston, she replied softly, closing the door behind her. In the hallway, Rebecca paused, one hand still on the doorknob. Something had shifted between them tonight, a lowering of barriers, perhaps. She wasn't sure what it meant, or if it meant anything at all. What she did know was that Preston Harrington was a good man who cared deeply for those under his protection. And somehow, against all odds, she and Thomas had found themselves among that fortunate number. The doctor arrived an hour later, setting Jim's leg and confirming that with proper care, the young man would make a full recovery. When Rebecca finally fell into bed as dawn was breaking, exhaustion claimed her immediately, but not before a final thought drifted through her mind. For the first time since Samuel's death, she felt as if she might have found a place where she and Thomas truly belonged. November gave way to December, bringing the first heavy snows and transforming the ranch into a winter wonderland. Rebecca settled more comfortably into her role, expanding her duties beyond what Preston had initially outlined. She took over mending the household linens, organized the chaotic pantry, and even began assisting Mrs. Whittaker with some of the cooking. Thomas grew stronger each day. At 5 months old, he had become a cheerful baby who delighted everyone on the ranch with his ready smile and curious eyes. Even the ranch hands, who rarely entered the main house, would stop by the kitchen door on occasion to make faces at the infant when he was in his basket nearby. Preston remained busy with ranch operations, but his interactions with Rebecca grew more frequent and less formal. Sometimes in the evenings, after Thomas was asleep, they would sit in the study where Preston would read correspondence or account books while Rebecca mended clothing by lamplight. The silence between them was comfortable rather than strained. On a particularly cold evening 2 weeks before Christmas, Rebecca was arranging pine boughs on the mantelpiece when Preston entered the sitting room, stamping snow from his boots. "It's beautiful," he commented, looking at her handiwork. "I can't remember the last time this house was decorated for the holidays." Rebecca smiled, pleased by his approval. "Mrs. Whittaker mentioned you don't usually celebrate much. I hope you don't mind the changes." "Not at all," he assured her. "It's nice to see the house looking festive." He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. "I was in town today and picked up something for Thomas." He produced a small wooden horse, meticulously carved and polished to a warm glow. "He's too young to play with it properly, but perhaps it could sit on a shelf in his room until he's older." Rebecca accepted the gift, touched by the thoughtfulness behind it. "It's lovely, thank you." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Rebecca felt a now familiar flutter in her stomach. These moments of connection had been happening more frequently, a shared glance over breakfast, the accidental touch of hands when passing items at dinner, the way his eyes sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't aware. "I also wanted to ask you something," Preston continued, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands, an uncharacteristic gesture for a man usually so composed. "The Christmas social in town is next Saturday evening. Would you and Thomas care to accompany me?" Rebecca stared at him, caught off guard by the invitation. In the 2 months she had been at the ranch, she had only returned to Redemption Creek once, to collect the few belongings she had left behind in her old cabin. I'm not sure that would be wise," she said carefully. "People will talk." Preston's expression remained neutral, but she detected disappointment in his eyes. "People always talk, Rebecca, but if it makes you uncomfortable, it's not that," she interrupted. "It's just—" She sighed, setting down the wooden horse. "My situation when you found me. It wasn't something that happened overnight. After Samuel died, I tried to find work in town. No one would hire me. The mercantile needed help, but Mr. Dawson said he couldn't have a woman with a crying baby in his store. Mrs. Sullivan at the hotel said the same. Even the laundry turned me away." Anger flashed across Preston's face. "They left you and an infant to starve rather than offer work. Most of them had their own hardships, Rebecca said, though the justification felt hollow even to her own ears. And Samuel had made enemies with his gambling. We owed money to half the businesses in town. All the more reason for us to attend the social together, Preston argued. You've nothing to be ashamed of, Rebecca. You did what any mother would do to try to save her child. I want those people to see that you and Thomas are thriving now. His vehemence surprised her. Rebecca studied his face, trying to understand his motivation. Is this about showing the town, or is it about something else? Preston's expression softened. Perhaps both, he admitted. I want them to see what I see, a remarkable woman who faced impossible choices with courage. And selfishly, I'd like the company. I attend these functions out of obligation to maintain business relationships, but they're tedious affairs without pleasant companionship. Rebecca felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. What about the ranch hands? Won't they find it odd that you're bringing your housekeeper to a social gathering? You're more than a housekeeper, Rebecca, Preston said quietly. You're a friend, someone I've come to respect greatly. The sincerity in his voice made her decision for her. Then we would be honored to accompany you, Preston. His smile was worth any gossip they might face. The day of the Christmas social arrived with clear skies and freshly fallen snow that sparkled in the late afternoon sunlight. Rebecca spent more time than usual preparing herself and Thomas for the outing. Mrs. Whittaker had helped her alter one of her old dresses, a deep green wool with modest lace trim at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't fashionable by any means, but it was clean and well-fitted. For Thomas, she had sewn a new outfit from fabric. Preston had brought from town a small white shirt and tiny trousers with suspenders. When she carried the baby downstairs, even Mrs. Whittaker exclaimed over how handsome he looked. Like a proper little gentleman, the older woman cooed, adjusting the tiny collar. You clean up nicely yourself, Mrs. Ellis. Preston entered the foyer as they were talking, and Rebecca felt suddenly self-conscious as his gaze traveled from her carefully arranged hair to the repurposed dress. For a moment he said nothing, and she worried that perhaps her efforts had fallen short. Then he smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached his eyes. You look beautiful, Rebecca. The simple compliment brought color to her cheeks. Thank you, and thank you for the fabric for Thomas's outfit. Preston himself was dressed in what she assumed were his best clothes, a dark suit with a crisp white shirt and string tie. His normally unruly hair was combed neatly, and he had trimmed his beard. He looked every inch the successful rancher, and Rebecca felt a flutter of pride to be accompanying him. The sleigh ride into town was magical. Preston had attached bells to the horses' harnesses, and their jingling melody accompanied the rhythmic crunch of runners on snow. Thomas was bundled in blankets between them, his eyes wide with wonder at the sights and sounds. As they approached Redemption Creek, Rebecca's nervousness returned. Perhaps this isn't such a good idea after all, she murmured. Preston's gloved hand covered hers briefly. We'll stay only as long as you're comfortable. If at any point you wish to leave, just say the word. The town hall was festooned with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. Lanterns hung from the eaves, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered ground. The sounds of a fiddle and piano drifted through the open doors, along with the hum of conversation and laughter. Preston helped Rebecca down from the sleigh, then carefully lifted Thomas into her arms. With a reassuring nod, he offered his arm and led them inside. Their entrance caused a noticeable lull in conversation. Rebecca felt dozens of eyes turn in their direction, and she instinctively held Thomas closer. Preston's hand came to rest lightly at the small of her back, a protective gesture that gave her courage. Mr. Harrington. Mayor Wilson approached, hand extended. Glad you could make it. His eyes flickered curiously to Rebecca and the baby. Mayor Wilson, Preston greeted, shaking the man's hand. You remember Mrs. Ellis and her son Thomas. The mayor's expression registered surprise, then quick calculation. Of course. Mrs. Ellis, you're looking well, very well indeed. Before the conversation could continue, a flurry of people approached to greet Preston, many casting sidelong glances at Rebecca. She recognized most of them, the shopkeepers who had refused her work, the women who had whispered behind their hands as she grew more desperate. Now they smiled and nodded, though their eyes held questions. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife who had been among the crowd the day Preston found her, approached with obvious curiosity. "Mrs. Ellis, what a surprise to see you here, and with Mr. Harrington, no less." The woman's tone suggested she was fishing for gossip. Rebecca straightened her spine and met her gaze directly. "Mr. Harrington kindly offered me a position at his ranch. I manage the household while Mrs. Whittaker handles the cooking." "How?" "Fortunate for you," Mrs. Peterson replied, her expression making it clear she suspected more than an employer-employee relationship. "And the baby seems to be thriving." "Thomas is doing very well, thank you," Rebecca said coolly. "Children tend to flourish when they're properly fed and cared for." Mrs. Peterson had the grace to look abashed, perhaps remembering her own lack of assistance when Rebecca had been desperate. Throughout the evening, similar encounters repeated themselves. Rebecca answered questions politely but firmly, never apologizing for her circumstances and never offering more information than necessary. Preston remained close by, occasionally placing a protective hand at her elbow or engaging Thomas with a gentle touch or smile. As the evening progressed, Rebecca began to relax slightly. The music was pleasant, the food abundant, and Thomas was content to be passed between her arms and Preston's. Several of the younger children at the gathering came to admire the baby, their innocent interest lacking the adult's judgment. "Would you care to dance?" Preston asked during a lull between conversations. Rebecca glanced at Thomas, who was beginning to doze in her arms. "I should probably put him down somewhere quiet." "Mrs. Wilson has a cradle in the side room where the little ones are resting," Preston suggested. "Just one dance." After settling Thomas, Rebecca returned to find Preston waiting at the edge of the dance floor. The musicians had just begun a waltz, and several couples were already moving in time to the music. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer," Rebecca admitted as Preston led her to join the others. "Fortunately, I am," he replied with a smile, placing one hand at her waist and taking her other hand in his. "Just follow my lead," and she did. Preston's confident guidance made the dance seem effortless, and Rebecca soon found herself enjoying the movement and music. As they circled the floor, she became aware of the watching eyes and whispered comments, but somehow in Preston's arms, the opinions of others seemed less important. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Harrington," she said as he expertly guided her through a turn. "Where did a cattle rancher learn to waltz so well?" "My mother insisted all her children learn proper social graces," he explained. "She would be horrified by most of my current habits, but some lessons remain." As the music continued, Rebecca found herself drawing slightly closer to Preston, aware of his solid presence and the surprising grace with which he moved. For a few precious minutes, she allowed herself to simply enjoy the moment, the music, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the security of his steady gaze. When the dance ended, Preston didn't immediately release her hand. "Thank you," he said softly. "It's been a long time since I've enjoyed a dance so much." The evening continued pleasantly enough, though Rebecca noticed that many of the town's women watched her with speculative eyes. When Thomas began to fuss around 9 o'clock, she was almost relieved to have an excuse to suggest they leave. The return journey to the ranch was quiet, Thomas sleeping soundly in Rebecca's arms while snowflakes began to drift lazily from the night sky. The peaceful silence felt companionable rather than awkward. "Thank you for coming tonight," Preston said as the lights of the ranch house came into view. "I know it wasn't easy facing those people after everything." "It was easier with you beside me," Rebecca admitted. "You gave me strength." Preston guided the horses to a stop in front of the house and turned to face her. In the moonlight, his expression was earnest and open. "You have more strength than you realize, Rebecca Ellis. I've watched you rebuild your life these past months with grace and determination. You don't need me for that." "Perhaps not," she conceded, "but it helps to know someone believes in me." For a moment, she thought he might say more. Something important hung in the air between them. Instead, he smiled gently and moved to help her down from the sleigh. As they entered the warmth of the house, Rebecca realized something had fundamentally changed tonight. They had presented themselves to the community not quite as employer and employee, not quite as a couple, but as something in between, something undefined yet undeniably meaningful. What that might eventually become, she wasn't yet ready to name. But for the first time since Samuel's death, Rebecca allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival, a future that might include more evenings like this one, with Preston Harrington looking at her as if she were something precious. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold at the Double H Ranch. Rebecca woke early, as was her habit, and found Thomas already awake in his cradle, cooing softly at the ceiling. She lifted him into her arms, breathing in his sweet baby scent. "Merry Christmas, my love," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. After dressing them both warmly, Rebecca carried Thomas downstairs to find Mrs. Whittaker already busy in the kitchen, humming carols as she prepared a special breakfast. "There you are," the older woman exclaimed. "And look at this handsome young man, all bright-eyed on Christmas morning." Thomas gurgled happily at the attention, reaching pudgy hands toward Mrs. Whittaker's flour-dusted apron. "Is there anything I can help with?" Rebecca offered. "Not today, dear, it's Christmas." "You just enjoy that baby and leave the cooking to me." Mrs. Whittaker wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Harrington is already out checking the stock, but he said to tell you he'd be back for breakfast, and he has something special planned." Rebecca felt a flutter of anticipation. "Did he say what?" Mrs. Whittaker merely smiled mysteriously. "That would be telling, wouldn't it? Now, why don't you go see what Father Christmas might have left in the sitting room?" Curious, Rebecca carried Thomas to the sitting room where a modest pine tree stood in the corner, decorated with paper stars, ribbons, and a few glass ornaments. Beneath it were several wrapped packages that hadn't been there the night before. "Look, Thomas," she murmured, kneeling to examine the gifts. To her surprise, several had her name written on small cards, and even more were labeled for Thomas. The sound of boots stomping snow from the porch alerted her to Preston's return. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway, his cheeks ruddy from the cold but his eyes warm as they fell on mother and child. "Merry Christmas," he greeted, removing his hat and coat. "Merry Christmas," Rebecca replied, gesturing to the presents. "You shouldn't have done all this." Preston's smile was almost shy. "It's nothing extravagant, but every child deserves a special Christmas, and every mother too." Before she could respond, Mrs. Whittaker called them to breakfast. The table was laden with special treats: fresh cinnamon rolls, crisp bacon, fluffy scrambled eggs, and hot chocolate with whipped cream. They ate amid companionable conversation, with even Thomas participating in his way, babbling excitedly from his makeshift high chair. After breakfast, they gathered in the sitting room for the opening of gifts. Preston insisted that Rebecca and Thomas go first. For Thomas, there were soft flannel blankets, a stuffed cloth horse, and a silver rattle that Preston explained had belonged to him as a child. "It's been in my family for generations," he said as Rebecca examined the beautifully crafted object. "I'd like Thomas to have it now." The personal nature of the gift touched Rebecca deeply. "Are you certain? Shouldn't it go to your own children someday?" A shadow crossed Preston's face briefly. "I've accepted that may not be in my future. I'd rather see it used and loved now." For Rebecca, Preston had chosen practical but thoughtful gifts: a warm woolen shawl in deep blue, a pair of soft leather gloves lined with rabbit fur, and most surprisingly, a small wooden box containing a delicate silver locket. "Open it," he encouraged when she hesitated. Inside was a tiny lock of Thomas's hair, carefully secured. Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "I noticed you had nothing of this sort," Preston explained. "Every mother should have something to keep memories close to her heart." "It's perfect," she whispered, immediately fastening it around her neck. "Thank you." Rebecca had prepared gifts as well, though far more modest. For Mrs. Whittaker, she had embroidered handkerchiefs. For Preston, she had knitted a scarf from wool she had saved from her meager salary and carved a small wooden picture frame, which held a sketch she had made of the ranch house. "You drew this?" Preston asked, examining the detailed rendering with obvious admiration. Rebecca nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "It's something I used to do before. I haven't had much opportunity lately." "It's remarkable," he said sincerely. "You have a genuine talent, Rebecca." After the gifts were exchanged, Mrs. Whittaker excused herself to begin preparing the Christmas dinner. Preston leaned forward in his chair, hands clasped between his knees. "There's one more surprise," he said, "if you're willing." "Another gift?" Rebecca asked, surprised. "More of an experience," Preston corrected, smiling. "I've had the men prepare the large sleigh. I thought perhaps we might take Thomas for his first proper sleigh ride around the property. The snow is perfect today. The idea was delightful." "That sounds wonderful." An hour later, bundled against the cold, they set out in a large sleigh drawn by two of Preston's finest horses. Thomas, wrapped in multiple blankets, sat securely on Rebecca's lap, his eyes wide with wonder at the jingling harness bells and the crunch of snow beneath the runners. Preston guided the horses along a path that showcased the beauty of the snow-covered ranch. They passed frozen ponds glittering in the sunlight, stands of pine trees heavy with snow, and distant pastures where cattle huddled together for warmth. "It's breathtaking," Rebecca said, taking in the winter landscape. "I've never seen anything so beautiful." "Nor I," Preston replied, though when she glanced at him, he wasn't looking at the scenery but at her. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Rebecca felt her breath catch in her throat. For a moment it seemed as if Preston might say something more, but Thomas chose that moment to let out a delighted squeal at her rabbit darting across their path. The moment passed, but the warmth remained. As they continued their journey around the property, Preston pointed out various landmarks and shared stories of how the ranch had developed over the years. His pride in what he had built was evident, as was his deep connection to the land. When they returned to the house, the aroma of roasting turkey greeted them. Mrs. Whittaker had outdone herself with a feast that would have fed twice their number. The day passed in a haze of good food, warm fires, and quiet contentment. That evening, after Thomas had been put to bed and Mrs. Whittaker had retired to her room, Rebecca found herself alone with Preston in the sitting room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting golden light across the room as snow fell gently outside the windows. "Thank you for today," Rebecca said, fingers absently touching the locket at her throat. "It was the most wonderful Christmas Thomas and I have ever had." Preston sat in the armchair opposite her, firelight playing across his features. "I should be thanking you. This house hasn't felt like a home at Christmas in all the years I've lived here. Today, it did." The simple honesty in his statement moved her. "It's strange how life changes," she mused. 3 months ago, I was at the lowest point imaginable, ready to give away my child because I couldn't feed him. Now here we are, celebrating Christmas in this beautiful home. Do you ever regret accepting my offer?" Preston asked suddenly. Rebecca looked at him in surprise. "Not for a moment." "How could I?" "It was unconventional," he acknowledged. "A single man offering a home to a widow and her child. I've seen the looks, heard the whispers in town. I never wanted to compromise your reputation." "My reputation was already in tatters," Rebecca replied with a wry smile. "The desperate widow begging strangers to take her baby, that's how they saw me. What could be worse than that?" Preston's expression grew serious. "You know what they assume now?" Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. She did indeed know what the townspeople assumed about her relationship with Preston. The sidelong glances and whispered comments at the Christmas social had made that abundantly clear. "Does it bother you?" she asked quietly. "What they think? Not for myself," Preston answered. "But for you and Thomas, I want you both to be respected." Rebecca considered his words carefully before responding. "Respect based on false assumptions isn't worth much. The people who matter know the truth of our arrangement." Preston nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the fire. After a moment of silence, he spoke again, his voice softer. "And what is the truth of our arrangement, Rebecca? It began as employment, certainly, but now—" He left the sentence unfinished, the question hanging in the air between them. Rebecca's heart began to beat faster as she considered how to respond. Their relationship had indeed evolved beyond employer and employee, but she wasn't entirely sure what it had become instead. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I only know that I've come to care for you. And I believe you care for us as well." "I do," Preston confirmed, meeting her eyes again. "More than I expected to, more than might be wise." The candor in his admission both thrilled and frightened her. "What are you saying, Preston?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together as if in prayer. "I'm saying that I find myself thinking of you and Thomas as family, not as my housekeeper and her child, but as—" He hesitated, then continued more firmly, "as the family I never expected to have. And I'm wondering if perhaps, in time, you might come to think of me as something more than your employer." Rebecca felt as if she couldn't breathe. The possibility that had been hovering at the edges of her consciousness for weeks was suddenly made real by his words. "I already do," she whispered. Preston's expression softened, hope kindling in his eyes. "I don't want to rush you, Rebecca. You've been through so much, and your priority must always be Thomas. I understand that. I'm willing to wait to give you all the time you need." "Time for what exactly?" she asked, needing him to be explicit about his intentions. Preston rose from his chair and crossed to kneel before her, taking her hands gently in his. "Time to consider whether you might someday accept me as more than a friend, as a partner, perhaps even as a husband and father to Thomas." The words hung in the air, momentous and transformative. Rebecca looked into Preston's eyes and saw sincerity, hope, and something deeper that made her heart race. "I don't need time to know how I feel," she said softly, "but I do need to be certain that you understand what you're asking. Thomas and I come as a package. He will always be my first priority." "As he should be," Preston agreed. "I would never ask otherwise. And I'm not the same woman I was before Samuel died," she continued. "I'm more cautious, less trusting." "You have every reason to be," Preston acknowledged. "I only ask for the chance to earn that trust day by day." Rebecca studied his face, the earnest eyes, the slight tension in his jaw that betrayed his nervousness, the gentle way he held her hands as if they were something precious. In that moment, she realized that she had already begun to love this man who had saved her and Thomas from the brink of disaster and asked for nothing in return. "I think," she said carefully, "that would be a journey worth taking, together." Preston's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then brilliant. He raised her hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "That's all I ask for now, the chance to build something real between us." As they sat together before the fire, talking softly of hopes and possibilities, Rebecca felt a sense of peace settle over her. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as a desperate widow and her reluctant savior, but as equals choosing a shared path. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white, a clean slate for new beginnings. Spring came early to Colorado in 1876, bringing with it new life across the Double H Ranch. Calves frolicked in greening pastures, wildflowers dotted the hillsides, and Thomas, now 10 months old, was pulling himself up on furniture, babbling constant streams of almost words and charming everyone with his infectious laughter. The changing of seasons had brought changes to Rebecca's life as well. Her relationship with Preston had developed gradually over the winter months, built on evening conversations by the fire, shared responsibilities, and the occasional brush of hands or meaningful glance that sent her heart racing. Preston had been true to his word about giving her time, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. By unspoken agreement, they maintained propriety in front of the ranch hands and Mrs. Whitaker, though Rebecca suspected the older woman had long ago guessed the direction of their relationship. Still, nothing formal had been declared, no promises exchanged beyond that Christmas night conversation. On a particularly beautiful April morning, Rebecca sat on a blanket in the garden behind the house, watching Thomas attempt to crawl after a butterfly. Preston had ridden out at dawn to check on a pregnant mare but had promised to return by midday. "There you are," Mrs. Whittaker's voice came from the garden path. The older woman approached with a basket of freshly gathered eggs. Letters came with the supply wagon, one for you. Rebecca accepted the envelope with surprise. She rarely received mail, having few connections outside the ranch. The return address showed it was from the lawyer in Denver who had handled Samuel's meager estate. "Thank you," she said, tucking it into her pocket to read later when Thomas was napping. Mrs. Whittaker lingered, her expression thoughtful. "Spring's a time for new beginnings," she commented, seemingly apropos of nothing. "Makes folks think about the future." Rebecca raised an eyebrow at the older woman's transparent hint. "If you have something to say, Mrs. Whittaker, perhaps you should just say it." The cook chuckled. "Just observing that Mr. Harrington has been spending an awful lot of time in town lately. And not just for ranch business, if you take my meaning." Before Rebecca could respond, Thomas let out a frustrated wail as the butterfly eluded his grasp. She scooped him up, brushing grass from his trousers. "I'm sure Mr. Harrington has many matters to attend to in town." Mrs. Whittaker hummed skeptically, "including 3 visits to the jeweler's shop, according to Hank." Rebecca's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "Mrs. Whittaker, are you gossiping about your employer?" "It's not gossip if it's true," the older woman replied with a wink. "Just thought you might want to prepare yourself. Now, I'd better get these eggs into the kitchen. Lunch in an hour." As Mrs. Whittaker returned to the house, Rebecca settled Thomas back on the blanket with his wooden blocks, her mind whirling with possibilities. Could Preston really be considering a formal proposal? The idea both thrilled and terrified her. Later, while Thomas napped, Rebecca remembered the letter. Opening it, she found a brief note from the lawyer informing her that a small insurance policy Samuel had taken out years ago had finally been processed. The enclosed draft was for $300, not a fortune, but more money than she had seen at one time in years. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the draft. It represented independence, the ability to make choices rather than having them forced upon her by circumstances. 6 months ago, such a sum would have seemed like salvation. Now it raised unexpected questions about her future. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard drew her to the window. Preston had returned and was dismounting in the yard below. Even from a distance, she could see the ease and confidence in his movements, the natural grace of a man at home in his own skin. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up toward her window and raised a hand in greeting, his smile visible even from afar. Rebecca's heart tightened in her chest. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that no amount of money could compare to what she had found here, not just security for herself and Thomas, but the possibility of true partnership with a man whose quiet strength and genuine kindness had gradually healed the wounds left by Samuel's betrayals. That evening, after Thomas had been put to bed, Preston invited Rebecca to join him for a walk around the property. The air was cool but not cold, with the scent of new growth permeating everything. Stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky as they strolled along a well-worn path toward a small rise overlooking the ranch house. "This is my favorite spot on the property," Preston said as they reached the top. Below them, lights glowed in the windows of the main house, the bunkhouse, and the distant cabin where the foreman lived. Beyond stretched the vast expanse of pastureland that comprised the Double H Ranch. "From here, I can see everything we've built." "It's beautiful," Rebecca agreed, pulling her shawl closer against the evening breeze. Preston turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "Rebecca, there's something I need to tell you," her heart quickened. "Yes." "I received a letter today from my sister's former fiancé, Thomas's father." This was so unexpected that Rebecca could only stare at him in confusion. I thought he never responded to her letters." "He didn't," Preston confirmed, "because he never received them. He was captured by Comanche raiders shortly after being deployed and was held captive for nearly 2 years. By the time he escaped and made it back to civilization, Penelope was long dead. He spent the years since trying to trace what happened to her and their child." "My God," Rebecca whispered. "Does he know about Elizabeth?" Preston nodded, his expression somber. I wrote to him months ago after finding his name in an army registry. I felt he deserved to know the truth even after all this time. Of course, Rebecca agreed. It was the right thing to do. He's asked to visit the ranch, Preston continued. To see where his daughter is buried. I've told him he's welcome any time. Rebecca reached out to touch Preston's arm. You're a good man, Preston Harrington. He covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and reassuring. His letter made me think about many things, about loss and second chances, about how quickly life can change for worse or for better. Something in his tone made Rebecca's breath catch. He turned to face her fully now, taking both her hands in his. When I saw you that morning in town, so desperate that you were willing to give away your child to save his life, something broke open inside me, Preston said quietly. I thought I was helping you, but the truth is, you and Thomas have given me more than I could have imagined. Preston, Rebecca began, but he gently pressed a finger to her lips. Please, let me finish while I still have the courage. He took a deep breath. For years after Penelope and Elizabeth died, I threw myself into building this ranch. I convinced myself it was enough, that I didn't need anything more than land and cattle and the satisfaction of creating something from nothing, but I was wrong. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Rebecca's heart began to race. What I needed, what I was missing, without even knowing it was a family, Preston continued, his voice growing more confident. You and Thomas have brought laughter and warmth into a house that was just a building before you came. You've reminded me what it means to care for someone more than myself. He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. This was my mother's. I had it sized for you. Preston took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee before her. Rebecca Ellis, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me be a father to Thomas and a husband to you for all the days we have left? Tears sprang to Rebecca's eyes as emotion overwhelmed her. In that moment, all the pain and struggle of the past year seemed to fall away, leaving only this man kneeling before her, offering his heart with such honest vulnerability. Yes, she whispered, then more strongly, yes, Preston, I will marry you. His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. When he rose to his feet, Rebecca didn't wait for him to make the next move. She stepped forward, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed him. Preston seemed momentarily surprised, then responded with enthusiasm, his arms encircling her waist and drawing her closer. The kiss deepened, becoming a promise of all that waited for them in the future they would build together. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Rebecca. I think I have almost from the beginning. And I love you, she replied, realizing as she said the words how true they were. I never expected to find this again, to find you. They stood together on the hilltop, wrapped in each other's arms as twilight settled fully over the land. Below them, the lights of their home beckoned, promising warmth and belonging. I have something to tell you as well, Rebecca said after a moment. I received a letter today too from Samuel's lawyer. There was an insurance policy. It's not much, but it's enough that. Well, I want you to know that I'm choosing to stay not because I need to, but because I want to, because this is where I belong with you. Preston's smile was tender as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. I never doubted that, Rebecca, but I'm glad you have the freedom to choose. It makes your yes all the more precious to me. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house, talking quietly about wedding plans and their shared future. Rebecca felt as if she were walking in a dream, but one from which she never wanted to wake. 3 weeks later, on a perfect May morning, Rebecca stood before the mirror in her bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. The wedding dress, a gift from Mrs. Whittaker, who had apparently been secretly sewing it for months, was simple but elegant, made of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in a loose-up doe, adorned with small white flowers from the garden. A knock at the door announced Mrs. Whittaker, who entered carrying Thomas, resplendent in a new suit that matched the one Preston would wear. "Oh my," the older woman breathed. "You look absolutely beautiful, my dear." Thank you, Rebecca said, smoothing the skirt nervously. For everything, the dress, your help with the preparations, and especially for your friendship these past months. Mrs. Whittaker waved away her thanks. Watching you two find each other has been reward enough. Now, are you ready? The ministers arrived, and your groom is looking as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Rebecca laughed, feeling some of her own nervousness dissipate. Yes, I'm ready. The ceremony was to take place in the garden behind the house, where spring flowers were in full bloom. As Rebecca descended the stairs with Thomas in her arms, she saw through the open door that a small crowd had gathered the ranch hands in their Sunday best, a few trusted neighbors, and the minister from town. And there, waiting at the end of the makeshift aisle beneath an arch of flowering branches, stood Preston. His face when he caught sight of her was something Rebecca knew she would remember for the rest of her days, a mixture of awe, joy, and love so powerful it seemed to illuminate him from within. Hank, the foreman, stepped forward to escort her down the aisle, taking the traditional role of giving away the bride. As they approached, Preston moved forward to take Thomas from her arms, holding his soon-to-be son with practiced ease while Rebecca and Hank completed the procession. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They exchanged traditional vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed her with such tenderness that several of the ranch hands let out appreciative whoops, causing Thomas to giggle and clap his tiny hands. The celebration afterward was lively, with abundant food, music from a fiddle player Preston had hired from town, and enough champagne to keep the toasts flowing. As the afternoon progressed, Rebecca found a moment of quiet with her new husband, watching as Mrs. Whittaker entertained Thomas among the flower beds. "Happy, Mrs. Harrington?" Preston asked, his arm around her waist. The new name sent a thrill through Rebecca. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted, leaning into his embrace. "And you, I have everything I never knew I wanted," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "A beautiful wife, a son to raise, and the promise of many years together." As the celebration continued around them, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Just 7 months ago, she had stood in the street of Redemption Creek, willing to give away her child because she could no longer feed him. Now here she was, a bride surrounded by friends, with a home and future secure in the love of a good man. Life could change in an instant, sometimes for the worse, but sometimes, miraculously, for the better. All it had taken was one person willing to see beyond her desperate circumstances to the woman beneath. One person who believed that a mother and child in need didn't belong in separate arms, but together, protected and cherished. As if reading her thoughts, Preston leaned close to whisper in her ear, "You know, that day in town when I said you'd both belong in my arms, I meant it literally. You and Thomas belong right here with me for as long as we all shall live." Rebecca turned in his embrace to face him, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain her joy. "And that's exactly where we'll stay." 5 years later, Rebecca Harrington stood on the front porch of the Double H Ranch house, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun as she watched the approaching riders. At almost 6 years old, Thomas sat tall in his own saddle, a miniature version of his adoptive father in everything from his straight-backed posture to the determined set of his jaw. Beside him rode Preston, one hand casually resting on his son's shoulder as they guided their horses toward home. Behind them came 3-year-old Elizabeth, named for the infant niece Preston had lost, perched securely in front of Hank, the faithful foreman who had become like family over the years. And bringing up the rear was Preston Jr. PJ. As everyone called him, just turned 2, sitting in front of one of the younger ranch hands, giggling as the horse picked up speed for the final approach to the house. "Mama," Thomas called out, spotting her on the porch. "Papa showed me how to check the herd count. I did it all by myself." "Did you now?" Rebecca called back, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. As the riders reached the yard, Preston dismounted first, then lifted Thomas from his saddle before helping retrieve the younger children. The three Harrington offspring immediately raced toward their mother, all talking at once about their adventures. "One at a time," Rebecca laughed, kneeling to embrace them. "Thomas first, since he's the eldest." While Thomas launched into a detailed account of his accomplishments, Preston approached more slowly, his eyes warm with affection as he watched his family. At 39, he was more handsome than ever, Rebecca thought. The years had added a few more silver threads to his dark hair and deepened the laugh lines around his eyes, but they had also relaxed something in him, softening the solitary rancher into a devoted family man. "How was your day?" he asked, joining them on the porch and dropping a quick kiss on Rebecca's lips. "Busy," she replied. "Mrs. Whittaker is preparing a feast for tomorrow's party, and I've been finishing the decorations." Tomorrow would mark their 5th wedding anniversary, and friends from across the county would gather to celebrate. The Double H had prospered over the years, expanding its operations and becoming one of the most respected ranches in Colorado. But more importantly to Rebecca, it had become the center of a loving family and a genuine community. "And how's this little one?" Preston asked, gently placing a hand on Rebecca's rounded belly. "Active," she laughed, apparently determined to be a dancer rather than a rancher. Their 4th child was due in just over 2 months, completing the family they had built together. Each pregnancy had been easier than the last as their circumstances improved, though Rebecca never forgot those desperate days when she had nearly lost Thomas to poverty and despair. "Children, go wash up for dinner," she instructed, ruffling PJ's unruly hair, "and tell Mrs. Whittaker we'll be in shortly." As the children scampered inside, Preston wrapped his arms around Rebecca, pulling her close. 5 years, he marveled. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday I found you in town, and sometimes it feels like you've always been here." Rebecca rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I was thinking the same thing earlier. How different everything might have been if you hadn't ridden into town that particular morning." "Providence," Preston said simply. "We were meant to find each other." Rebecca tilted her face up to his. "Do you ever regret it, taking on a desperate widow and her child?" Preston's expression grew serious. "Rebecca Harrington, in the 12 years I lived here before you arrived, I built a ranch but not a home. You and our children have given me more joy than I ever thought possible. So no, I have never had a single regret except perhaps that I didn't find you sooner." He kissed her then, a tender reminder of the love that had grown between them over the years. When they parted, Rebecca smiled up at him, her heart full of gratitude for the life they had created together. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "Mrs. Whittaker will have our hides if we let dinner get cold." As they walked into the house, the sounds of children's laughter and the tantalizing aroma of home cooking greeted them. This was everything Rebecca had once feared she would never have again: security, happiness, family. All because one man had looked at a desperate mother and hungry child and seen not a burden, but a blessing. "You know," Preston said as they paused in the doorway, watching their children help set the table, "that day in town I thought I was rescuing you. But the truth is, Rebecca, you and Thomas rescued me right back." Rebecca squeezed his hand, knowing he was right. They had saved each other, creating from their separate losses a family stronger than either could have built alone. And in the end, that was the greatest blessing of all: not just survival, but a life rich with love, purpose, and belonging. Together, they stepped forward into the warmth of their home, where the future they had once thought impossible stretched before them, as vast and promising as the Colorado sky.